Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to How Can Donors Best Support Police Reform in Non-Western Contexts. My name's Jon Jackson. I'm a professor in research methodology at the London School of Economics. You might ask why I'm doing this. Well, my research is in policing, so I'm connected to the Mannheim Centre for Criminology. I just happen to be in a methodology department. More importantly, this event is hosted by LSE Ideas, the Institute for Global City Policing, and the Urban Violence Research Network has been convened by Dr. Liam O'Shea at LSE and Dr. Zoha Waseem at UCL. So this is the final of 4 sessions examining how to reform the police. The first session was hosted by King's College London, and that looked at police reform in the Global South broadly, examining what works to reduce police malpractice and the importance of local context. The second session looked at what contributes to successful organizational level change. And the third session explored what makes police reform and police reform movements successful. So today we examine the effective ways that donors can support police reform in the Global South. The opportunity for donors to successfully impact reform varies from context to context, but research and interventions constitutes a large body of the research on police in non-Western contexts. So our distinguished panel includes experts with extensive experience researching donors' impact vis-a-vis other drivers of police transformation. It also includes practitioners who have worked with police organizations in Africa, the Middle East, and former Soviet Union, who have first-hand experience delivering overseas development assistance in support of security and justice objectives. So with no further ado, I am going to introduce the first panelist, first speaker. So the first speaker is Alice Hills, and the title is, as you'll see when we move to the slides, the challenges facing and opportunities open to donors seeking to influence police reform in the Global South. So Alice Hills is visiting professor at the University of Leeds, previously a professor of conflict studies at Durham and of conflict and security at Leeds. Her research is on police community relations in Somalia, Somaliland, and Kenya, and was recently funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. More broadly, her research interests include police development, post-conflict policing, and exploration of police forces' patterns of evolution and change. She's published widely on these topics, with her works including policing post-conflict cities and making Mogadishu safe. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you very much, Jon. Well, a few years ago, an American academic working for the World Bank in Equatorial Guinea asked a disillusioned Colombian colleague why on earth she was working on aid programs she regarded as absolutely futile. And her answer to him is actually very relevant for this meeting today, because, slide please, this is what she said. Slide please. Looks as though the slides got lost, so I'll just read it out. She said, at the top, no one cares. Oh, here we are. Okay, that was the Colombian colleague's response. And I think it's so relevant for what we're talking about today, because really she provides the only realistic excuse, I think, or reason or rationale for operating in this particular world. Whatever the case, her quote actually sets the tone for the next 10 minutes, because it's a salutary reminder that takes us directly to the challenges confronting donors who want to actually implement assistance plans in some of the places where actually liberal democracies really aren't necessarily much of a model. I'm not saying that assistance, by the way, doesn't work, that it can't work. It can, especially when it involves transferring the skills associated with, quote, proper policing to elite units in particular. That's the investigative techniques, bomb disposal, and so on. You just have to ask Turkey or the US, and you can see that's the case, or indeed perhaps the EU's new European Peace Facility. But overall, I can't help thinking that the results of aid and assistance programs tend to be superficial, temporary, and local. But we know this, so there's no point in me hammering on about it. It makes much more sense today to look at the more creative possibilities, or at least some of the marginally more creative possibilities associated with assistance. And both are particularly evident in Somalia, which is an extreme example you can get. It's the one I actually want to look at today. Slide, please. This is just a street in Mogadishu, but it just gives you a flavour of what we're actually talking about. I think one of the reasons actually why Somalia is particularly interesting for us here is because its experience reflects the difference between policing delivered by the state, which has been a dominant theme so far in the seminars, and policing delivered through social processes in a chronically insecure and, very important, legally plural society. I'm not going to go on about Somalia's problems because they're so well known. Yes, it's an incredibly entrepreneurial and resilient society, but it's also a patriarchal and very violent clan-based society that much prefers opaque and informal decision-making to the accountability and institution-based approach preferred by donors. So it really isn't surprising that the billions of dollars, euros, sterling, yen, lira, and renminbi devoted to assistance programs have actually made remarkably little difference to the majority of Somalis' lives. Let's face it, donors can't really do much to influence the thinking of the average untrained, illiterate, militia-oriented Somali policeman. Slide, please. Despite this, there are actually some great examples of donors offering positive and pragmatic use of assistance to facilitate a more internationally and also locally appropriate form of policing. I've got two examples that I want to use to give you a flavour. The first is a neighbourhood watch scheme in Mogadishu's Waberi district in the mid-2010s. And the second is a basic policing scheme introduced into Kismayo and Baidoa at much the same sort of time. And together they show how donors such as DFID can actually support policing provision. And I assume, by the way, that we're really talking about DFID here, rather than, say, Turkey or Egypt or their equivalents. So have a look first at Mogadishu, just to offer the example. It's because it's a great example of very small scale assistance that actually made a difference. Only for a short time, but it really worked. And despite it relying on, amongst others, DFID and US advisors, it was a Somali-driven scheme, and that's important. So if you just imagine Neighbourhood Watch, I don't really need to go into the details, but imagine it's a pyramid. It's a structured household level approach that actually tried to facilitate intelligence gathering at the local level. It was basically actually surveillance for anti-terrorism purposes, but it did in fact improve community relations enormously. It was successful partly because it built on a popular model already used in Mogadishu, and partly because it was supported not only by the many local women, and polygamy means that there are a lot of women-led households who wanted to protect their sons from al-Shabaab's influence, but also by the mayor, local police officers, and district officials. And for a year or two, it was very, very successful. It really did improve local community relations. It improved community morale no end. Slide, please. And it even led to an increase in house prices and rents, which is good as good an evidence as you can find. So you can see it got very jolly at times. Yes, it had huge problems, but it worked. So what did this owe to donor assistance? Actually, three things are worth noting. First, DFID provided minimal and cost-effectively support. It gave computer stations and so on, which were welcomed. It could equally well be very penny pinching. It wouldn't pay for the chlorine that actually was needed to remove the nasties in the stagnant water alongside a funded football pitch. Thirdly, and most importantly, it had a wonderful UK police advisor who was sympathetic and respected professional, who didn't try to impose what works in any UK city you can think of. Well, unfortunately, the scheme didn't actually last for too long, or not, success didn't last for too long, because the then mayor, wanted more than his share. So, it detracted from the overall success, but it was a very good example of small efforts actually making a big difference. My second example is actually re-establishing basic policing in Kismayo and Baidoa. This was about pragmatically facilitating the minimal requirements needed for the most basic form of policing, actually, that could perhaps help to facilitate eventually development and stabilization. Again, I'll just make three quick observations. First is that donors invariably have sophisticated, expensive, and incredibly precise lists, but actually this project is a great reminder that actually policing emergent and basic in particular, its requirements are minimal. Forget about strategic vision, police doctrine, blah, 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 all the usual. Initially, at least, and I do stress the initially, it requires little more than sufficient numbers of capable, identifiable, and locally acceptable recruits to be armed, paid, and deployed in relatively safe locations. Secondly, it doesn't provide answers to which rank level offers the best prospects for assistance. I mean, my own feeling is this is probably mid-ranking, but that's another issue we can perhaps come back to. And then thirdly, perhaps more importantly for this particular seminar's theme, the project illustrates the way in which international and local approaches to policing can be mutually accommodated at best. Because anecdotal evidence suggests that most details were actually handled very pragmatically. Neither side made unreasonable demands, and implementation often took the form of a simple, flexible compromise. DFID reports may state that the programme was seen as a contribution to building a more inclusive and political settlement and all the usual sorts of things that you're only too familiar with. But actually, in practice, DFID and AMISOM handled their involvement very lightly. They allowed the clan-related concerns of elders and local politicians to influence the implementation. Similar comments can be made, but actually it did seem to work in a remarkably attractive way at the time. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, donors need to be realistic and they need to be pragmatic about what can't be changed, just as well as what can be changed. They need to accept that given the complex interplay of actors and issues in non-Western societies, the best that can generally be hoped for is a locally acceptable form of policing that's good enough in the circumstances. And I've got a great quote that sums this up. Slide, please. As Colin Smith, the former police advisor in Basra, said when he saw a banner outside Baghdad's police college in 2006, just enough is realistic, even if it is discouraging. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. Lovely background there. I think we're all very much looking forward to getting out into countryside like that over the next few months. So our next speaker is Andrew Faull, who's going to be talking about reform efforts in South America. Now, just a quick introduction, Andrew. Andrew is a senior researcher in the Justice and Violence Prevention Programme at the Institute for Security Studies. He completed his DPhil at the Centre for Criminology in Oxford and has held various academic and practitioner posts, including at the University of Cape Town, as well as having served as a reservist constable for over 7 years with the South African Police Service. Andrew's research interests cover crime, violence, policing, and human security, and he is currently project lead at the ISS for a collaborative project with the South African Police Service promoting the use of evidence-based policing. He's also published widely on policing issues, and his latest co-authored book, Police Integrity in South Africa, is hot off the press, or at least was published in 2020. So I'll pass over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, John. Just to clarify, I'm going to be commenting on South Africa rather than South America, but no problem. I think it's clear. It'll be clear. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me today. I'm Andrew Faull. I am a recipient of donor funding in the support of police reform in South Africa. As you can see from my opening slide here, I'm generously funded by the Hans Seidel Foundation, which is a German foundation that supports our work. Just out of interest, this is an image from the early COVID lockdown in South Africa. So these are police officials enforcing the 1.5 meter distance between queuing people outside a shop. I don't think they fired their rubber bullets here, but it's clearly not a great image. Just a little bit about the ISS. We are a Pan-African non-governmental organization. As I say, we are the recipients of the funding that we are talking about today. We work at the national, regional, continental, and international level with partners in a broad effort to promote human security, peace, and flourishing in Africa. However, I work in the Justice and Violence Prevention Program, which is linked to the Pretoria office. I'm based in Cape Town, but our work, the Justice and Violence Prevention Program, is specifically focused on South Africa, where we spend most of our attention on policing, prosecutions, violence, and good governance in general. So I want to start with a bit of a provocation. There's only so much one can cover in 10 minutes. So I'm going to give a broad presentation, and we can get into details during the Q&A. But I want to borrow from Peter Singer, the Princeton-based Australian philosopher, and also Will MacAskill at Oxford. Peter Singer asks, if you are a wealthy, self-made person with an expensive pair of shoes, you're walking home, you see a child drowning in a shallow pond, do you wade into the pond to save the child and damage your shoes? And the moral argument is, of course you do, because a child's life is far more important than those shoes. And the loss of those shoes is a very small cost for that relatively affluent person compared to the life of a child. Will MacAskill puts it more emotively, saying you need not lose anything to run into a house and save a child, but saving that child will stay with you for the rest of your life. It will be a defining moment for you. And the argument here is that affluent societies have a moral obligation, including individuals, and better off individuals like myself in unequal societies have a moral obligation to make a small financial sacrifice, which can have a massive impact in other people's lives. Now, I want to use this experiment to ask questions around policing. Would you, or would we as a donor community, or anybody able to intervene, would we save these miners from a life of poverty? These are miners at a Lonmin mine. Lonmin was a British registered company. This is a platinum mine in the northeast of South Africa. They were protesting in 2012 for what they called the living wage, 12,500 Rand a month, which is about £600. And they were living in informal settlements. They were subject to violence, and they were saying, right here, leave our country or give us a living wage. So this international capital needs to leave or give us a living wage. Would you save those miners from poverty, or would you save them from a dangerous police response? Unfortunately, the state police, the South African Police Service, were called in to manage that protest, and it resulted in one of the greatest tragedies in democratic South Africa, which was the shooting of 112 protesters and the killing of 34 of them. So do we intervene at the economic level or at the policing level? Those miners are also living in difficult economic circumstances. The economically precarious in South Africa are most vulnerable to violence, which saturates our society as well. So a simple version of our murder stats would be that there are 58 murders a day, but of course, most of those murders happen over weekends, and most of them happen in very particular areas. So certain portions of South African society are far more vulnerable than others. How do we protect these miners from violence? How do we protect them from poverty? How do we protect them from police abuse? And I suppose, thinking about the question at the heart of this session, how can donors support police reform? There isn't a simple entry point, and I think Alice also hinted at this now. You can't simply reform police by engaging with police, but where does one enter to have the greatest impact? Do we reform the political structures, good governance, democratic elected leaders? Or if there are abusive leaders, do we invest in rule of law, criminal justice institutions so that they can hold leaders accountable? Do we support civil society, people like myself who provide some kind of oversight and accountability to the state as a non-governmental organization funded by foreign money? South Africa is very fortunate to have a strong, robust, independent media, which does a lot of holding the state to account. Economy, if we could just click our fingers and give everybody in South Africa, we have 40% unemployment in this country. If we could give everybody a job that paid the same as a police constable, all boats would rise, and you would suddenly have an empowered population who could hold the state accountable. They could hold politicians accountable, they could hold police accountable. And then the relationships, how do you tie all of these together? How do you make sure that people like Andrew Faull, working for an NGO, can engage with police who are going to listen respectfully, can engage with the private sector, can engage with politicians, can engage with other civil society actors and the media? And ultimately, I think this is where we really need to make, where we can have the most impact. However, I can only do my own little bit, and I'll tell you a bit about the project that I I lead at the ISS. My colleagues focus on different areas. We've got some colleagues focusing on police leadership, others focusing on violence prevention, but I'm particularly trying to promote understanding and use and generation of evidence for the improvement of police practice in South Africa. So our goal in this project is for police decisions, plans, and activities to be based on the best available evidence for what works to prevent crime and violence and to promote trust. We have to include the trust element because, of course, you can be a very effective crime prevention system or structure or institution while abusing rights, etc. And South Africa has very low levels of trust and confidence in its police. But while I state this, and while this is our goal, we still can't pretend that the political leadership, the police leadership, the country's inequality, the poverty aren't at play. South African police officials are not neutral bodies onto which we can project or inject knowledge and understanding about empirical evaluation and the like. They are people who are struggling to put food on the table. Even though police salaries are quite decent in South Africa, police officials are part of extended precarious networks of unemployed people. And so that salary has to support many people. It can't just support the police official. How do we work? We do the common sense things that many of us here probably do. We try to convene communities. So we've been trying to foster a community of evidence-based policy making, research generation, research application between police policymakers, researchers in South Africa. Unfortunately, this was all obviously destabilized during the pandemic. We haven't been able to meet in person for a while. But we do a lot of communication, strategic communication. So we have policy briefs, we have reports, we've got a resource guide, we do a lot of media engagement, and a lot of one-on-one support to partners when they are willing to work with us. So the South African Police Service, excuse me, is pursuing a few pilots at the moment under this evidence-based policing umbrella. And the Western Cape government, which is a province in South Africa, they are pursuing quite a holistic violence prevention strategy, which includes a focus on evidence-based violence prevention and policing. Of course, it's one thing to have a vision, it's another thing to get different tiers of government and numerous different stakeholders to collaborate to deliver an effective intervention. Acknowledging all of these challenges and the fact that there are so many different potential entry points, I want to close off by suggesting that there is a lesson from the evidence-based policing and violence prevention literature, which we could keep in mind for in answering this question about effective use of donor funds. So the evidence for violence prevention suggests that police and violence prevention partners are most effective when they are working cohesively with a shared vision and a shared plan that everybody understands, everybody knows what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what they're working towards. So we're on the same page. We can deploy that plan, we can evaluate it, we can revise it, we can iterate, and in so doing, we keep everybody aligned, we generate evidence as we go, and we move forward. And I would suggest that this is one way in which donors can think about how to most effectively use their money. I think this is obviously most relevant to something like DFID, which is part of a much broader government structure where you will have diplomatic aspects involved. You have economic and trade partnerships that can be brought into the picture, which is very different to perhaps the foundation that funds me, which is a German foundation linked to a province in Germany and is much smaller than, for example, the GIZ. However, I do think that it's important that we try to align things. I also just want to end by saying I think that this idea, Renee Mitchell from the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing has a great phrase that too much police reform and too much police knowledge transfer is about common practice, where police practices haven't been evaluated, and so common practice is best practice. I think we just need to nudge ourselves towards intentional experimentation, collaboration, iteration with domestic partners. We need to be careful of soft power and the potential negative view of soft power, neo-colonial type projects, while pushing as hard as possible for positive reforms in respectful partnership. And I'll end things there, and hopefully you can chat some more later. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, and sorry for confusing South Africa for South America. So our next speaker is Tim Heath, who is going to be giving us some mostly personal reflections on lessons and principles around good donor practice in supporting police reform. So just a little introduction. Tim is a conflict advisor in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. He recently joined the new central FCDO team, leading on another acronym for SSR in conflict, affected and fragile states. His most recent overseas posting was in Lebanon, where amongst other things, other areas he worked on UK support to the Lebanese internal security forces and the Lebanese armed forces. Tim was also posted to Jerusalem some years back, where he acted as donor, co-chair of the security sector working group alongside the Palestinian Ministry of Interior in Ramallah. And he advised on UK support to the Palestinian security sector in the West Bank. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me. Yeah, there's still lots of talk of DFID. So I'm in this this merged department brought together the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and DFID. So yeah, as you said, my experience and the reflections I'm going to give briefly now are really, I guess, coloured by those places that I've worked on SSR most closely. So they might not be applicable to all, but I think they probably generally are. They probably don't offer much new, but and they're actually relevant to engaging in reform processes more broadly, I guess. I have an issue with the term reform, which is sometimes not appropriate in the context that I've worked in, but we can come back to that perhaps. But I mean, first of all, the security sector is a sensitive sector, right? So you need to build up relationships in this sector. It can take years. You really need to build up trust and invest in that. And having the right implementing partners for programs is absolutely critical to that. Also, donors can have a habit of coming in and out. So it becomes very ad hoc, lacking continuity. That undermines trust and can really leave national counterparts floating often for years. So trying to stay engaged, although we'll come on to some of the reasons why donors may need to disengage, is important too. Of course, on the donor side, governments change, priorities change for funding. There are funding cycles to deal with, and funding amounts can change over time. So those are some of the challenges on the donor side to maintaining continuity. I'd say prioritizing and applying understanding of the sector is the fundamental for me. You really need to understand what you're getting into. This is sensitive. These sectors are not just very compartmentalized. They're part of a much bigger political picture. So gaining an understanding of the sector and its place in the wider context is absolutely critical. And I think in the past, from my experience, donors have not invested as much as they should have done in the analysis piece. So it's something that certainly, in where I've worked over the last few years, we've invested more. We've made it a really core requirement of tendering for project implementers for new programs, for example, to demonstrate how partners will invest in analysis, what kind of analysis they can bring to the table, and how they'll keep that updated and apply it, including in design work, theories of change and so on, right through to monitoring, results frameworks, risk management and so on. So really getting bringing political economy analysis into programs. Looking at who the actors are, the champions, the blockers, incentives and disincentives, right from big picture right down to individuals that we're working with and engaging with, and investing in analytical capacity in our national counterparts too. So to make sure that national counterparts have got data, have got the analytical skills to apply it themselves as well for strategic planning and so on. And this is crucial for being conflict sensitive and trying to avoid doing harm, which is very easy to do in this sector if you don't get it right. So whilst implementers are very important as part of that, we can have a bit of a tendency to subcontract the relationship, if you like, and subcontract the analysis to implementers. So that's a lesson I've taken away over the last few years, is even though you might have the best implementers, do invest yourself as an embassy in building, maintaining close relationships with national counterparts, doing the analysis, and also triangulating the analysis, because often program managers and implementers are very, very close. They're too close almost. Sometimes you have to stand back a bit and have a challenge function, also invest in independent evaluation, of course. Be patient, but not too patient. So the kind of change that we're often talking about that's really needed is fundamental. It's very challenging, very difficult. It can upset balances. It can be overwhelming, especially when security actors, the police and others are faced with huge day-to-day pressures. As others have said, you know, they may be struggling to put food on the tables of their families even. And it requires cultural shifts. So those leaders also need to be taking risks, and we have to be very empathetic to the situation that they find themselves in. It can also be very destabilizing, as I said, if we get it wrong. So probably more than we'd like to, we need to listen to national counterparts and really understand where they're coming from. And to some extent, at least, really go with the pace of reform that they think that they can do, that they're comfortable with. And part of that is not swamping them. I've seen instances where donors have come in and their implementation model is to take over a whole floor in the Ministry of Interior to run police reform. They take over the car park with their black SUVs. And I've seen this really backfire and essentially them being thrown out in the end, and it leading to a real sort of destabilizing moment with police reform. But actually in that case, there were some positives out of that because it led to the ministry really thinking through what it wanted. And there was some good experience there of finding a different model that they were comfortable with, that empowered them, gave them visibility, and really put them in control, but with back office support. So patience also required on the donor side in terms of the sort of incentives that we face as donors to spend money. When we get allocations, we have to spend to quite strict targets, deadlines, which isn't great if, one, you haven't got it right from the design stage, and two, it just doesn't go like that. So you need to be adaptable, you know, use adaptive, flexible programming approaches, but also have a dialogue with those that hold the purse strings. I've had cases where I've landed in a place with given a program saying, this is ready to go, you're going to spend this much by this time, and found actually walking in to see the police in the ministry that they're not bought in. In fact, in that case, I had to talk my manager down to keeping the money on the table, but not spending it for 2 years before the ministry came round. We've been doing kind of reform in the meantime without program funding, but in the end, after 2 years, they knew exactly what they wanted and we supported it. So for me, that was best practice. For my boss, it was not spending the money. I think also donors can encourage progress. Donors have got their own incentives. So often, for example, people will be searching for, okay, what are the results here? We've been investing X amount of money for so many years. How can we really demonstrate progress? Sometimes those issues will be issues that the police really need to tackle themselves as well. So we might be patient with strengthening accountability and human rights compliance and see incremental progress, but at some point, donor probably needs a little bit more than that. And I found that there are moments when we can use capital that we've built up over years of support to really encourage that in clever ways, really, by bringing evidence to bear to senior decision makers in the police or the ministry to show what the benefits of moving forward on that could be. In this case, I'm thinking about survey results, for example, that show that the public really welcome greater transparency, and that might counteract the risks to internal morale by being more transparent around disciplinary investigations, for example. A link to that is work on supply and demand side at the same time. Now, not all donors can do everything across a sector and be completely holistic, but at least the coordinated approach across donors to make sure that the investment's not just in the institutions, the state, but also on the demand side, on civil society, perhaps on Parliament and other key institutions, and connecting up the two so there's a constructive dialogue. Take sustainability seriously. If you don't, it can come back to bite you and really wreck all the progress that you've made. And measure long-term and incremental progress. So it's just something I think we're pretty bad at in terms of taking a really long perspective on progress over time, which is often very non-linear, of course. But all that said, learning the lessons is the easy bit, but applying them in specific contexts is really tricky. This is complex stuff. Over.
Okay, thank you very much. So our last speaker is Liam O'Shea, and he's going to introduce the How to Reform the Police project. So a quick introduction to Liam. So he's the Dinam Research Fellow at the Department of International Relations at the LSE. From 2018 to 2020, he was a government advisor in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. He's worked as a consultant for a number of organizations on security and justice in developing countries, and he's an expert on politics and police reform in the former Soviet Union, which was the topic of his PhD from St Andrews. At the LSE, he is leading the development of this project, www.howtoreformthepolice.com, which is a global platform to collate and synthesize the international evidence on police reform. So Liam is going to talk about this fantastic project. So over to you, Liam.
Thank you very much, John. So as John said, the platform I'm developing aims to synthesize the evidence on how to do police reform, particularly interventions targeted at reducing police violence and corruption. So the problem it aims to solve are, well, first, there are evidence gaps. There are evidence gaps, for example, on how to reduce police violence everywhere, including in the West. The evidence on police corruption is a bit stronger, but the large body of the evidence comes from Western police studies and examples from Western cases. It also attempts to address some siloing in the evidence. So there isn't a great deal of crossover between Western criminology and, for example, security sector reform and international development, although that is improving. And evidence is not always accessible. So as John said, I was in the Foreign Office. Frankly, as a practitioner, you often don't have time to read much at all. It's half time is managing your inbox. So evidence has to be made accessible, but it's often dense or behind paywalls or scattered all over the place. It takes an awful lot of work to be able to get what you need. But there is good news. There is evidence out there. There's a large body of several decades of evidence from Western police studies. There's increased research by criminologists from and in the Global South, as well as anthropologists. And there's the grey literature from donors from NGOs and civil society. There are also models to make evidence more accessible. So the UK developed a number of years ago a number of what works centres that cover various areas of social policy, health, education, local government, and so on. And the idea of these centres is to make this evidence more accessible. Now, I'm just going to show rather than tell. So I'm going to share my screen to give you an example of a what works centre. I just get a thumbs up from people to know they can see my great. It's always worth checking. So this is the Education Endowment Foundation. And the reason I really like this is you've got a list of interventions, how much they cost, the evidence strength, and their impact. If you click on them, you get more information on what it is, how effective it is, how secure is the evidence, what are the costs, and what else I should consider. And the aim of this project is to replicate this for police transformational or reform. And it needs to do a number of things. So first of all, I've built the website and the back-end systems, which I'll explain. The data you see is just for demonstration purposes and is made up. So don't quote me on anything, any of that. But what the platform will have to do, well, it focuses on violence and corruption because these are the most prominent problems in much of the Global South and indeed with violence as we're seeing in the Global North. It needs to look at both organisational change and reform. I'm going to come back to that bit about reform later. It needs to link the evidence from the West and the Global South. The evidence from police studies and criminology is particularly strong on organisational level change. Evidence from security sector reform is much stronger on the environments. And it needs to do not just look at what works, but what looks where. As we saw in Alice's presentation, policing in Mogadishu is very different from policing in Milton Keynes. We can't assume that evidence from the latter is going to work in the former. So this is the landing page of the platform. As you can see, I've sought to replicate the Education Endowment Trust. We have some interventions, costs, evidence strength, and impact. Again, this is mock data, so take that bit with a pinch of salt. Let me now explain some of the data behind and the systems behind the platform. So really, we have three sets of data. First is reference information. It's fairly self-explanatory. The Zotero, which is a reference management software, stores information on the title, author, year of publication, etc., etc. The second set of data is impact and evidence scores. So what the project will aim to do is add, use some methodologies to do just that. At UCL, they've developed the EMI methodology, which can be used to assess both the impact of evidence, but also the impact of an intervention, but also the strength of evidence behind it. There's a little bit more information on the screen on some of the areas that looks at. And we also have the PRIME system, which is used to measure police reform in fragile states, but can be used in more stable contexts as well. And it has 6 areas which can be used as indicators. The third set of data in blue is the World Bank's governance indicators. So what these enable us to do is analyze the reform environment. Brian Taylor did this in his book on state building in Putin's Russia, but I think it has application far further. What Taylor did is he averages World Bank indicators for governance effectiveness and political stability and violence to come up with a state capacity metric. He then uses 3 other metrics to come up with a state quality metric, which is broadly levels of accountability, rule of law, control of corruption. It's easier again to show than to tell, but I'll give you an example of how this might work. This is use of force policy again. So what it has is what is the intervention, how effective it is, how strong is the evidence, and below what are the costs and how can I implement it. But this is the what works where piece. So imagine we have 15, 20 studies on use of force, but in different environments. If we have the geography and the time period when an intervention was carried out, we can pull the data from the World Governance data set and then map studies according to the context in which they're focused on. So in the lower quadrant, we have fairly low capacity and low state quality. So these are more fragile states. In this quadrant here, we have higher state capacity, but lower in state quality. So they're more non-democratic. And in the upper quadrant, we'd have high capacity and high state quality, where you'd expect most of the evidence to be. So the next step in the project is to put a team together, start coding, organizing, testing the methodology. We have a proposal currently out there. I'm very glad to say that Andrew is one of the partners of the team with the ISS in South Africa. We also have ETAM in Mexico. And the idea is that we create a team which has investigators from the Global South and the Global North to begin processing through the data. And it will also need to look at police reform. So most of what I measured is more organizational level change, which is generally more implementable. But as Andrew showed in his graph, indeed, police reform is more complex. So the project will look at deploying comparative political science methodologies to look at comparing what are the more macro variables that affect police reform. And it will do so by looking at case studies such as police reform in Georgia, Singapore, South Africa, and Mexico, and using that methodologies to identify those bigger variables. So that's it in a nutshell. I've got 3 other things to say to wrap up. The first is this isn't the only sort of platform. There are others out there, but they do slightly different things. So the College of Policing has a What Works Centre, but it's more on crime, reducing crime than it is on police reform and police violence and corruption. There's also the Global Policing Database in Australia, a very thorough database, but it doesn't provide synthesis, is what I'm proposing. The second point is we're looking for funding. So if anyone's got any ideas, or indeed if you've got a large pot of funding, we have more detailed plans, and we're very glad to share those and also to take any ideas you may have on the project, how to improve it. The final thing which I'll end with is this won't solve all the problems, because not all the problems are to do with lack of evidence. I won't go into that, but what it will do is help improve the menu. Reform windows, when they open up, are often short-lived, and sometimes the people involved don't have the best available information to them on how to deliver reforms. Similarly, having been a practitioner, things can get chucked on your desk, and you may not know the best way to move forward. What this project will aim to do is to help provide that, a clear menu to help reduce police violence and corruption. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Liam. Fascinating stuff. So we're now turning to Zoha Waseem, who is our discussant, who is going to give a brief set of remarks and insights based on the talk. So over to you, Zoha.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for their presentations and insights. It's a privilege to listen to everyone's experiences and their projects. And I've engaged with some of your work in the past, so this has been really informative. As a discussant, I wanted to briefly summarize and touch upon some of the key themes or recommendations that have come up in these four presentations. So first, we heard about the importance of starting small. So Alice Hill mentioned in the case of Mogadishu that small efforts can make a big difference. And this also helps donors be realistic and pragmatic, can or whatnot. On this note, he also said that funding can change and leadership can change. So a practical approach or a more sustainable approach that perhaps values smaller efforts or more short-term efforts might be more beneficial. Secondly, we heard about, or there was a theme about keeping things local or thinking locally. So, and that's linked to the idea or the importance of that local and international approaches should accommodate each other, which was something that Alice also mentioned. And on that note, we also heard that international involvement or donor interference should be light, and locally led initiatives and programs are likely to be more successful in certain cases. We also heard about the importance of building trust and partnerships, which can promote collaboration between different sectors, and collaboration between different domestic partners, wherein each partner knows their role and their contribution, and that's something that both Andrew and Tim touched upon. And linked to this is what Tim mentioned about investing in local counterparts as well. And then fourthly, or finally, we heard about the importance of evidence-based policing, which can help drive police reform efforts. And this was brought out in Andrew's presentation and his ongoing project in his work with the South African police, but emphasized more strongly in Liam's presentation, and linking evidence from the West, from the Global South, but which is something that Liam touched upon, but knowing that evidence from certain parts of the world might not translate to other parts of the world, as Liam cautioned in our sort of broader efforts at police reform. So I think these were some of the key themes that resonated in each of the four presentations and offered some useful takeaways. And as we transition now to the Q&A part of the event, I would like to take this opportunity to pose two very open and broad questions, broad enough for anyone to take up if there's time. And I think one of them at least is influenced by Andrew Faull's presentation and what he said about having different entry points to police reform in different contexts. So the first question I had was that civil society organizations are increasingly working alongside social movements or supporting social movements in their calls for police reform or even abolition in certain cases. So how can or how should donors work with civil society organizations that support social movements that take a critical approach to police reform and policing generally? Is there a possibility in the future for donors to see social movements as creating possibilities for collaborations and collaborating on police reform initiatives? And can or should donors tap into the influence of social movements to advance calls for police reform transparency and accountability. And the second question I had was that police reform projects or programs can be quite dividing. So the opinion about them can be quite dividing, even within the police, and they might not get much buy-in from certain officers or certain departments. So for example, police reform efforts in Pakistan, which is where the country I focus on, they call for implementation of a specific legislation concerning police administration, oversight, and management. While certain lobbies support this, it has gotten much resistance from political parties across the country, as well as police officers, partly because of the politicization of the police. But this particular initiative gets a lot of support from civil society organizations, the media, justice sector, etc., that want to see policing more depoliticized. In such a situation and in such divided social political context, what should donors do? Whose voice counts and whose input counts? Because ultimately the question is, who will the reform serve? And it's difficult to get all stakeholders to agree on who the beneficiary of reform should be. So whose voice counts, and how can donors ensure that their funding and their money is serving the right audience, so to say, for better choice of words, and not politicizing the issue further, if that is the important aim of donor-led police reform efforts. So that's all from me. I'll keep it short and brief. Thank you once again for your presentations. It's been a strong finish to our event series. So thank you, and back to you, Jon.
Okay, so thank you very much, Zoha. So could I ask everyone on the panel to put their videos on for the Q&A? I wondered whether we should start with Zoha's first question, excuse me, about donors working with civil society organisations to support police reform. I'll just open it up. Does anyone want to have a go at this question first?
I don't mind starting us off. But I see Liam might be next. I guess, so, yeah, in fact, Tim's probably best placed to answer this. I would think that as a donor agency, you've got so many relationships to manage that you don't want to burn bridges by getting behind something that doesn't have majority support. So if it is a if there's a majority support in a civil society movement, then there's less risk. But you don't want to burn your diplomatic ties. I would think, but Tim's better placed. And I think from our perspective as the ISS, I think we are probably often ideologically aligned with many grassroots protests and the like that might be more abolitionist in their sentiment, but we are the kind of more neutral face of police reform, so we can engage without burning bridges, but that means we're potentially less emotional and maybe less honest in the way that we advocate. I'm not sure what others think, but I would think ultimately it's about relationship maintenance for the donor.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Andrew mentioned Tim might have something to say. I don't want to put you on the spot, Tim, but
yeah, no, not smarter than that though. No, I think we can certainly support pro-reform coalitions, whilst being very cautious about being seen to back a social movement which has often got a political connotation, of course. But and there are often a lot of grey areas and overlaps between social movements and civil society, and certain civil society partners are easier to support than others, say. So I think there is scope there, but also just being very wary about as a donor trying to get too close, and also we accidentally do sometimes act a bit pushy to get civil society to do things that we want to do and spend our money on, so which can be the death of social movements and civil society. So I think yes, support coalitions, but be careful about trying to get too close and direct, and at the risk of undermining. But a lot of this, although one has to be very cognizant of the politics in amongst all of this, big P and small p, as long as you're cognizant of that and you get it, I think you can approach this as a quite technical issue. So which kind of takes the political sting out of it, if you like. Over.
Okay, thank you, Liam or Alice. Alice, you want to?
Yes, I think I would agree with everything Tim said. There is a danger of ignoring the fact that actually this is very much a business opportunity for many civil society organisations, but equally they may be the only possible way into some of the issues, some of the big themes and challenges that donors wish to address. So, yeah, it's quite a tightrope, but no easy answers, full stop.
And Liam, finally.
Yeah, so one thing that struck me particularly for Alice's is donors have far less power than is often more commonly thought. And therefore, we need to choose our entry points quite well. And that often doesn't happen. So in some contexts, it will be totally appropriate to work with the police. And in other contexts, we might as well forget it and start working with civil society and the coalitions and building those coalitions of the willing. And I think a lot more could be done that, because actually what often happens is a project starts for whatever reason, and then it's on a dependency path because we've started a project engaging with the Ministry of Interior of country X, and it's been going for a while, but actually there's not really the support that wasn't there from the beginning. One interesting thing I'll put as a slight curveball is I think there needs to be more discussion around what to do with, or how to manage spoilers in reform, because the discussion is often based around just the coalitions of the willing, but it's not always clear on what to do with those parts. In fact, it's usually not said what to do with those who are not only acquiescing, but will actively be opposing.
Okay, thank you very much. Zoe had a second question, but I want to, we'll circle back to that in a little bit. So I want to put a question to maybe Alice and Andrew, which is, why isn't there more work critical of assistance? I don't know whether Andrew or who wants to say something about that.
Why isn't there more work critical of donor assistance?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose Alice partly hinted at it in that it's a business for some. So, I mean, that need not be sinister. There needs to be funding for people to be empowered to act often, particularly where the free market isn't creating space for people to work otherwise. But I do think I suspect that there are difficult conversations behind closed doors between donors and partners. So again, I found Tim's input very interesting in terms of managing those relationships and not forcing things, and giving local partners the time and space to act in an environment that they are hopefully more familiar with, and at a scale that they're hopefully more familiar with. Of course, there needs to be a balance between not having your partner take your money and sit there doing nothing. But by the same token, we can't have unreasonable deliverables and little tick box performance targets, which mean we publish reports that have no impact. So I think they are difficult conversations, but probably generally behind closed doors, because those who are receiving donor funds wouldn't be served by a public spat. Alice, do you have any thoughts?
I think there has been a lot of critical analysis and commentary actually over the past 30 years, because we're basically talking about since the early 90s. But it's become slightly difficult. Are we talking about practitioners, academics, policymakers, or some who are straddling various worlds? It's very difficult because there might be different answers to all. And I think if we are taking donors from industrialized liberal democracies as our focal point today, the DFIDs of this world, if you like, let's face it, not only is it a business, but DFID is in the business of actually giving away money. It doesn't exist unless it does it. So if you add in that, plus the fact that a lot of people are genuinely, I think, wishing, willing, longing to actually reform, horrible word actually, I don't really like it, but they're trying to reform unpleasant policing, trying to stop others being badly hurt, etc., then you begin to understand how quite often over those past 30 years, there have been a fair number of missionaries promoting rather than saying, hold on a minute, Are we doing a long-term review? And if it comes to that, actually, how many long-term reviews do we actually know exist of DFID's work or indeed anybody else's work? Not the ISS's, for example, not that many, and I can only assume it's because actually nobody really wants to know the answer, because I can't help thinking that the answer is, in personal opinion, I know, that actually the results have been less than glorious. However, they have actually made a difference in small scale, temporarily and locally, as I say, and that actually may be, as our Colombian lady said in my first quote, actually what really matters. Doesn't answer the question to analysis, but actually, Leon, perhaps you should pick up on this lack of critical thinking, slightly more, or in a rigorously scientific fashion.
Yeah, I think so. Alice is right. There has been critical literature, and I think one way of organizing it, just as a thought game, is where does the biggest source of injustice come from? And for some scholars and for practitioners, it's poor institutions, and that tends to be the more donor approach. But there's another set which you could say are a bit more realist, and it's chaos and underdevelopment in various contexts. But there is another set of scholars who I'd say highlight more the global inequalities and inequalities in the global system, and that frames their research. And for them, assistance can be seen as a tool for imposing Western models and Western economic reforms, for example. So that research does exist. I think where it can be both useful and not so useful. It's not so useful when the fit doesn't fit the problem. So it's all very well talking about global economic systematic injustice, but sometimes in the context, it's the warlord down the road or the organized criminal or the lack of street lighting, whatever it is. But on the other hand, where the critical comes in is we're talking about systems of coercion. That's what define police. So we need to have this in mind. And I know from my own research on Georgia, for example, which is an example of very successful police reform, but it was also accompanied by quite some stringent neoliberal economic reforms. So the question then comes back to, whose order is assistance promoting? So I think it's important to also keep it in mind.
Thank you very much. I mean, this question was raised in the Q&A by Martin, and he was particularly interested in German donor agencies in Africa. And there was just to say there was a follow-up comment from Ewan mentioning the EU's border protection agency and allegations. So let's move on to, because Alice mentioned she didn't like the phrase police reform. Someone in the chat asked, actually it was Martin, where is it now? Why do donors only talk about police reform and never the transformation of the police? This could be a question that maybe Tim wants to start with. I think we all know the gist of this question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I mentioned, I have a problem with the term reform. I think maybe it works in some contexts, not others. Maybe it's just my own conceptualization sometimes, but in this field as well, we kind of wax and wane between different terminology as well. And I'm probably like most other people and come back to SSR as a bit of a lazy shorthand for what we're talking about. But transformation, yeah, for me, we're often just talking about security sector development, really. Even if one was to go to the chief of police in country X and says, we're here to help you reform, it can be a little bit scary, to be honest, and a little bit off-putting. So in a current case we've got, it's really not the moment to be going in and talking about reform, even though the security forces and the ministries need to be taking pretty fundamental steps to address a major crisis. But it's much easier to have a conversation around a more strategic response, development, at least maintenance of progress, rather than reform, which sounds a little bit threatening quite often in the context that we're working in.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Does anyone else want to talk about issues around organisational level versus police reform? Martin, in a comment further down, asked about procedural justice becoming gaining traction in northern policing environments. Anyone else? Us.
I think it's much more important to look at what police do rather than how they're organised or what they're called or indeed what terms we use. I think it was actually in the first seminar, possibly the second one, where there was some discussion about whether in fact we were really talking not about reform, in quotes, but actually not transformation either, because that strikes me as far too ambitious. Professionalisation, modernisation. And I think those are actually quite good words in a way, because that, in my experience, tends to be what appeals to certainly mid-ranking educated officers. It's one of the attractions of these international models that they find that they can get personally interested in. Actually, probably that's enough comment there. But yeah, it's quite an important issue. Actually, the only other comment I will say, yes, I think terminology, terms come and go. Again, if you think back to the 90s, DCAF, for example, they led the way with SSR originally, then it all shifted, then it shifted again. Does it really matter what we call it? But I do think I would just go back to emphasize my first point, is that actually what police do is much more important than what they're called or what we call them or what we're referring to.
Okay, thank you, Alice. Does anyone else want to chime in on this? Okay, so Liam. Liam, you're muted.
That's it. Often in security sector reform, we talk about the end point, really, of models, visions, what we want to see. But there is less real strong evidence on the starting point. And how do we change that starting point, which is often a very corrupt, patrimonial, violent, not really under the control of the state, maybe implicated in organized crime. Might not be all of these things, and there are good people in such systems. But how do we start with that and move on? Because like I said earlier, donors don't have that much power. And if we're looking at how to build Denmark, rather than starting with this is what we have and how to nudge it in the right direction, that's a problem. And then there was a question in the chat, which I thought was quite interesting, about lessons from Honduras. I mean, I know nothing about Honduras, I'm sorry, but it's a good question because there isn't that much good analysis of successful reforms per se, really. I mean, I know of Georgia because I studied it, and I'm aware of Singapore and Honduras, but you know, that analysis, really a deep analysis of what has changed and led to these things, it isn't as strong as it could be. We have much more analysis of the problems than we do on the solutions.
Can I just make a quick comment? It's a good point, Liam. Several years ago, David Bailey, who sadly died a couple of years ago, asked around his sort of circle of friends and acquaintances who knew of a normatively driven example of reform, of what you could all hold your hand up to and say, yes, this was genuine reform. And the best anybody could manage at the time was, well, Northern Ireland, perhaps, Sierra Leone, perhaps. Oops, no, things have been happening there. And that was it. Nobody amongst this circle of actually quite well-known academics and practitioners and policymakers could come up with what could be described as normatively driven reform. So for what it's worth, there are these big issues still sitting.
Okay, thanks everyone. So G. Leslie asks about whether the focus should be on reducing police use of live fire and proportional use of force. I don't know whether anyone would like to tackle that. Maybe Zoha. Should that be a focus? Attack that first and foremost.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
So should the focus be on reducing police use of live fire, proportional use of force? I mean, G. Leslie was referring to the sorts of kind of machines that send some, you know, viscous material that kind of stops people moving around as opposed to shooting them.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've seen in certain contexts that the use of live fire, for example, like in places like Kashmir and Pakistan, I don't see it happening. I think rolling back and reducing the use of force is fairly difficult in certain contexts, and there's a lot of investment that goes into the militarization of policing. And that's something that I'm not seeing a lot of police reform initiatives target as well. So a lot of reforms that are kind of, you know, that are driven or being implemented in certain countries of the global south, they are, especially like in South Asia, for example, they do bring in a lot of investment towards the militarization of policing. So I'm kind of critical on that front. But perhaps from other contexts, we've seen something different. But I have yet to see, at least in the case of Pakistan, any kind of discussion that prioritizes the use of less force or non-lethal force.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to comment on providing non-lethal equipment, etc.?
I'll come in for a sec. So in South Africa, we have quite a lot of discussion about use of force, and much of it is influenced by the global north. We've kind of 10 years ago, we were talking about use of force policies and the need for better monitoring. And it's another chicken and the egg. I think one could carry out experiments that show that policing can successfully take place without armed police officials. Obviously, we can see it in the UK, but even in South Africa, the easy knee-jerk response in South Africa is you can't disarm police because they'll all be killed. But police are often more vulnerable because they are carrying firearms, because that makes them a target for robbery. But both linked to interventions around use of force and any other potential intervention, I think it requires strong leadership within the organization already. This goes back to the kind of chicken or an egg thing. Where does one intervene first? You can prove a use of force policy efficacy, or prove a less than lethal weapon efficacy through an experiment. But if you haven't got good leadership that can then take that example and motivate for change in the organization, that doesn't necessarily help. So I think we need these multiple entry points. I see some other hands.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I can come in on this. Yeah, I think this is one of the toughest areas certainly for donors, in my experience. It's really, you know, a major interface of where the police meet the public around public order policing, and it's where it can all go very, very badly wrong. So at the same time as being something that donors really need to be in there, influencing, trying to help change, it's also one of the most risky in terms of risk appetite of ministers to sign off on this kind of thing. It's a very high bar. But where I've seen interesting collaborations around this has been, for example, where I'll just say international human rights organisations, when they've been doing reports on violence by the police and by the army, they've also highlighted the fact that the security forces are unprotected. That's leading to more panicky reactions and quicker escalation to the use of lethal force. And I think having that kind of balance and mutual awareness around these issues means that there can be a bit more of a dialogue. And it's not just about providing the equipment, but it's the dialogue that goes around it in terms of people understanding what the pressures are on the police when they're out, they're not being arrested and so on. Things like this are very real that can lead to the use of force. And so it may be that actually reducing police violence might be best tackled by intervening on force rotation, for example, so that the officers on the street are not overtired. There's different ways to cook the same fish.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question from Irvin. So Irvin, I'll just read out the comment and then the question. So Andrew talked about violence prevention as well as police reform. We know that Latin America and the US spend big money on punishment without significant impact on violence. And this is the question, if donors invested in proven violence prevention, such as plans and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, including reducing poverty, improving education and reducing violence, do we think this would have a knock-on effect on reducing violence by the police?
I'm happy to respond first. So again, it's the chicken or egg. I don't think you can only have violence prevention interventions. I like Thomas Apt's analogy of kind of stopping the bleeding. You need the police to respond to stop the bleeding, and then the violence prevention interventions and the development of a society that can provide dignified lives to people with jobs and sustenance comes after. Whether one can provide parenting and the like interventions in the absence of effective rule of law, I think would be ineffective. So there needs to be a balance. But if one had to choose between them, I would say stop the bleeding with effective rule of law first, so that you can instill long-term violence prevention interventions.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to comment?
John, I'll comment if I may.
Sure.
I read an interesting paper not so long ago by Robin Engels from the University of Cincinnati. And the reason it's interesting is it's a review of measures that are commonly recommended to reduce police violence, like introducing body cameras and so on. And what interested me is that the evidence is really not very good on those more micro-scale interventions. But that's interesting, if a bit pessimistic. But it's also that's where the best evidence lies. Most police studies, a large bulk of it is from. So if it's not great from the West on how to do it, you can be left with a feeling of, well, the evidence base is pretty low overall. I think it's important to acknowledge that, is that the evidence overall is quite limited. On a more optimistic note, I wouldn't say that there aren't lessons from police studies on how to reduce police violence and that the evidence isn't out there. I'm thinking of the work of Clifford Stott, who's written a lot about how to reduce or how to police protests. And it reminded me of research I did in Georgia. So Stott basically says that if police come in aggressively, it's more likely that the crowd will behave aggressively. And I remember doing an interview with a police officer, an Austrian police officer in Georgia, and he said that the Georgians had learned actually to police protest much better. But then after about 10 minutes, they lost it and went back to their old practices, and the protests became more violent. But I think it's an example of something that could work in the right circumstances. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Liam. So there's a question from G. Leslie, another one, asking whether compulsory ongoing evaluation mechanisms should be key to provision to all police funding reform. Does anyone have any thoughts on whether we should the viability of attaching compulsory ongoing evaluations to these sorts of things, whether that will be successful, the importance?
I'm happy to come in, but I'm also don't want to look like the mic hogger. So does anyone else want to go first? Go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say you go first. I'll come in after you.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that, yeah, I mean, in terms of the idea that we want to promote evidence-based practices, we would want there to be built-in evaluation with anything. However, one doesn't want evaluation to become a tick box process that one does on the side, which produces evidence that doesn't tell us anything. And I think that's a big danger. If we look at performance management systems in police organizations, the CompStat type spin-offs, the South African Police Service has a really impressive performance management system. It's called the Efficiency Index. but it ends up providing perverse incentives that lead to poor policing or undemocratic policing. So if everything's going to be about measuring reported crime, then I just turn you away when you try to report your crime and my performance goes up. So we just need to think very carefully about what we're measuring, how we're measuring, and whether it's actually helping us.
Yeah, and I mean, I always say build evaluation into the design of the program, right? Which I see not always done great. I don't know how to do it as well as I wish I could, and it's challenging. But also, you need to be able to adapt your evaluation as the context changes. But I think one of the things around evaluation that I'm really up for is doing more joint donor evaluations. It's something that we're getting into a bit more now in partnership with ISAT, for example, of some joint donor programs in Africa. I think there's a lot more scope to do that. It does take more preparation and donors coming together to agree when evaluations are going to be held, how they're going to be funded, what they're going to focus on, so they do satisfy each donor requirement, if you like. But that's something where I think there's a lot more scope to collaborate on.
Okay, thanks both. Anyone else on the panel, or is that who I want to? Now, Zoha asked a second question, which was about ensuring that money is well used and not politicized. It was a very eloquent question. I wonder whether you want to just repeat the whole thing so that my attempt to summarize it doesn't do damage to the
sure. I can try again. I think the question was basically that sometimes when reform programs or efforts are introduced, the sort of buy-in can be quite divided. So you have support from certain sectors, such as civil society, for example, or the judiciary and NGOs, etc., and the media, but you might not find that much interest or that much political will, let's say, or that much commitment from certain police officers. So then how do you kind of manage that kind of divided commitment towards a police reform initiative or a program? And when you have so many stakeholders, then whose voice counts, or who is the primary audience in such a situation? I think it was something along those lines.
So who wants to have the first go at this?
Tim has his hand up.
Oh, it's a legacy hand, but very, very tricky. I mean, I think you have to go back to really trying to get your head around the incentives and disincentives. I mean, I think, if you try to effectively put leaders in a position where they're taking responsibility and having visibility, there's a risk it can backfire if they're not really on board. So in some cases, it's been a case of mapping who are the people behind the immediately obvious people who might be more on board and might have the ear of those people, who, if you can also help provide them with the right evidence, for example, or experience from another South case that they can bring to the attention of their seniors to keep them on board. I mean, I think there is, in this sector and all the others, really, there is always the risk that donor support is used to legitimize security actors that really are not legitimate. So the way that you build that into your risk management processes, your political messaging and so on is critical, and seeing when it's happening. Maybe using the capital from that sometimes to push a little bit too, for things like accountability.
Great, thanks, Tim. Anyone else on the panel?
I've got a question that comes from this, which I think isn't asked actually by enough donors, and it should be asked very early on, is how much are police paid? And how does that pay relate to the living standards? If police are not paid, but they are authorized to use force and power, they will use that power in corrupt ways. And that's just the way it is. And many police across the world are actually more predatory, involved in organized crime than we would like. And if you're dealing with that, well, it's not exactly a great starting point. Obviously, then the question comes around, well, how do you manage that? And I think often you can't. Like, you might have to go look elsewhere. You might have to demand, raise demands for adequate salaries if that's possible. You might even have to pay salaries. And indeed, and that was something Alice touched on, was like, what are the basic, what's the good enough? And I think more attention should be paid to the good enough, in particular that question around police pay. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually, because stipends are actually one of the biggest issues for donors in Somalia, because the question of stipends actually dominates many discussions between Somali officials, politicians and officers and donors to a detrimental effect. But linked to that, there's also another similar question, actually, which is, why should we expect police to behave relatively kindly towards the, what do you want to call them, residents community? Again, the terms change, when they themselves may actually be untrained, unpaid, and treated like animals. This actually came up repeatedly when I used to work on Nigeria, because mid-ranking and lower-ranking officers would say, of course you can't expect us to do any differently. We're treated like animals, particularly when we're trainees, when we do receive something akin to training. And I think that's a comparable issue for many countries, not Somalia, but for many countries. So training needs to be in there too.
I think I lost connection while Liam was speaking, but I gather you were talking about salaries, and Alice picked up on that. I just wanted to say that, yeah, my understanding of the research is that salaries only make a difference in terms of police behavior if police can't kind of meet their basic needs. And so I think obviously we want everybody to have dignified lives and to have a living wage, but I don't think we should fall into the trap of the discourse that says only expect decent behavior when people are paid well. So in South Africa, police will complain about not having enough money, and yet the starting salary puts them in the wealthiest 5% of income earners in the country. That isn't, so they're not getting an unjust salary for the country. It's just that the country is so unequal that there's a massive problem. So I just think we need to identify the nuance. But I also wanted to say, following on from what Tim was saying, I think in response to Zoha's question, it would be useful for if a foreign donor government in particular is working directly with police on a particular issue, but they're also working with civil society bodies like ours, it would be useful if we were aware of that, because you might find that, yes, they accept my proposal that I want to promote evidence-based policing, and yet they are bringing a police official over to tell war stories about policing in London, and those war stories coming from a police official might be more emotive to a police ear than Andrew Faull talking about dry research. And so it would be useful for the civil society to know that there's this other thing going on, so that we can, as I say, better align these things. They need not be in conflict, but we don't want to undermine one another's projects unnecessarily, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, there's a couple more questions, but I really do think that with 1 minute left, it's probably not worth brokering them. So perhaps I can just finish by saying thank you to everybody on the panel, and thank you to Zoha for the discussant. And just to direct people's attention to the recordings of previous sessions, which can be found at lse.ac.uk/ideas/events. /ideas/podcasts. And yeah, check out the website for upcoming events. So this is ideas, lse.ac.uk/ideas/events. So I'm reliably told that the whole thing crashes violently and very quickly at 2:30. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks all to the questions and the answers. And
thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.